Continuing on page 9, 20-0443, discussion, presentation from Sheriff, Marshal, and Police Department, policies and procedures regarding use of force, sponsored by Commissioner Ellis.
Mr. Chair, I'll just be brief in introducing this. I want to thank our chief and representatives from our sheriff's office and from our marshal's office. I had reached out to them and asked them if they would come and share, and they were all very prompt in their response and willingness to do so. And I want to thank them for their leadership and service, and for the service that all the men and women of their departments provide to the citizens of this county. We know the work they do is vital to the safety and well-being of our citizens. It's challenging, it's risky, and often goes without recognition. We also know that these are folks that have dedicated their lives to law enforcement, very well tenured folks. And I know that they've been impacted greatly by the recent events of brutality and death which have taken place within this country at the hands of law enforcement. And I know that they are equally as angered and upset on many fronts, and probably even more so by these events than many of us are, because it makes their lives and their jobs more difficult, and it only represents the worst of law enforcement, and they work really hard to prevent these types of events from ever occurring underneath their watch, and I just thought it was really critically important that for the citizens of this county to hear from the folks who represent us. I mean, we've got 3 different law enforcement agencies, some of them doing stuff that aren't traditional police work, but nonetheless, come into situations where use of force may be necessary. And I think having that dialogue and discussion of what our actual, kind of use of force policies are, what kind of training our officers go through, in beginning that dialogue within the county is really critically important, so that all of our citizens trust that all our law enforcement officers are doing the right things. We've got the right policies in place. We've got the right accountability measures in place. We've got the right transparency measures in place. And if there are opportunities for improve and strengthen that, that they're here to listen to that and do that. So I'll stop with the introduction and let them share their remarks with us today, and hopefully we have a good dialogue with that. So, Chief.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Darrell Halbert. I'm the Chief of Police for the Fulton County Police Department. As you will notice on your screen, the most common phrase is use of force. Our department, we haven't used the term use of force since 2008 in our policy. We use the term response to resistance or aggression.
I'm sorry, you used what?
Response to resistance / aggression. I'll speak up, sorry. Our guidelines for a response to resistance is when it's necessary to preserve the peace, prevent commission of offenses, or self-inflicted injury. When preventing or interrupting a crime or attempted crime against property, when making lawful arrests and searches, overcoming resistance to such arrests and searches, and preventing escapes from custody. When in self-defense or defense of another against unlawful violence to that person. And our policy also indicates that before we utilize any response to resistance, when practical, we shall provide a verbal warning. Continuum. Some of you all may know about the use of force continuum, as it's called. Basically, those are levels of force that an officer may utilize. First level being officer presence. Second level being verbal commands. The next level being empty hand control techniques. The next level being the utilization of either OC spray, baton, or the taser. And the highest level, of course, is firearms. In terms of what standards we go by in terms of when an officer can reasonably use that force, it is the Supreme Court's ruling on the objectively reasonable standard. Now, this standard indicates that an officer's actions must be reasonable based on that officer's perception. I know we have the benefit now with the advent of body cameras and cell phones and things of that nature that we're able to take an incident and go frame by frame by frame and to really pick apart that incident. That's actually what the Supreme Court refers to as 20/20 hindsight. That should not be used, because the officer is required to make that split-second decision based on the circumstances that he or she is faced with at that particular time. There are no universal set of rules that govern when an officer should respond to resistance/aggression, use of force, or how much. For instance, I'll take myself as an example. I'm 5'10", 185 pounds. A suspect my size, you have an officer that say is 6'3", 250. It would be reasonable to assume that that officer would be able to use a certain level of force, be it the empty hand control techniques, without resorting to maybe a baton or a taser or something of that nature. But now, take that same set of scenarios and apply it to a 120-pound, 5'3" female officer. That officer may have to resort to using a taser or a baton or something more, given the same set of circumstances. So you can't apply the same levels to every individual and every incident. So it's the officer's perception and a number of factors that determine what level of force that he or she may use. Those factors are whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the officer or others, the severity of the crime, whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest, whether the suspect is a flight risk, and like I just alluded to, the relative age, size, strength, and physical capability of the officer compared to the suspect, and the time available for the officer to make that decision, which, again, sometimes is split second. Moving on, our chokehold policy. The Fulton County Police Department does not use any type of physical neck restraint and does not train similar control techniques. No prisoner will be restrained in such a manner as to restrict breathing or cause choking. That is verbatim from our policy. And what I'm attempting to do, Commissioner Ellis, he provided a series of questions, and I thought that was a good framework to provide this presentation to answer those questions. Our policy for the prohibited discharges of firearm, we do not allow warning shots. We do not allow an officer to fire from a moving vehicle at another moving vehicle unless it's to remove the threat of deadly force. Reporting requirements. Our officers are required to report the response to resistance whenever the officer discharges a firearm, whenever an officer takes an action that results in injury or death to another, whenever an officer has a response to resistance through either the use of lethal or less lethal weapons. Again, those less lethal weapons being the OC spray, the baton, or the taser. Whenever an officer engages in a weaponless response to resistance aggression will be defined as hard hand techniques. Hard hand techniques are considered punches or kicks, whereas soft hand techniques are considered wrist locks or something to that nature. In terms of accountability for violation of our policy. But prior to getting into this, what we also have is a response to resistance board. Anytime an officer uses a response to resistance, that report is then sent to the response to resistance board. That board then takes the information, the report, any body camera footage, and they review that. They call the officer in, ask a series of questions to determine whether or not that officer's response to resistance was within policy and the law. If we do find a violation, corrective actions that we can take are additional or remedial training and or counseling. In terms of keeping with the progressive discipline policy, those things can include an oral reprimand, written reprimand, suspension, demotion, dismissal, and by no means do we have to necessarily go in that order, because a more serious offense may require a more severe penalty, and that could result in dismissal. Our department, we do wear body-worn cameras. That way we're able to capture our interaction with the public. We do it at the arrival of the scene of a call, upon initial contact with a suspicious person, or during a potentially adversarial contact. Right now, we're currently looking at a new camera system, which will better enable us to capture more footage. The camera system that we're looking at now, if you have an officer on the scene wearing his or her body camera, which is recording at the time, if another officer comes on scene, as soon as that officer gets on scene in close proximity, then that body camera begins to record as well. And this camera system has the ability to start recording anytime an officer removes his or her weapon from their holster. The Fulton County Police Department, we also have an early warning system. It's called Guardian Tracking. It's a computer-based system. Whenever an officer has a response to resistance, that incident is placed into the Guardian Tracking system. There's a threshold of 180 days where if an officer has 4 incidents within that time frame, the supervisor, that officer supervisor, is then notified to then go back and review those incidents to make a determination whether or not something else needs to happen with that particular officer, what we call an early intervention, to make sure that there is no issue with that officer utilizing too much force, using it too often, whatever the case may be. Of course, we do have a formal written policy, and that policy is available to the public upon request. De-escalation training. The state of Georgia requires that all police officers stand in the training, council certified law enforcement, receive de-escalation training every year. In addition to that, the governor's initiative also requires annual training on use of force as well as community policing. Duty to intervene. Currently, we do not have a duty to intervene policy. There are several drafts that I'm currently looking at to see which best would suit our agency. When looking at a policy, I want to ensure that there are no unintended consequences of having such a policy. Hopefully within the next week or two, that should be completed. And finally, one of your questions was about the no-knock warrants. Our policy does allow the use of no-knock warrants, although we have not executed a no-knock warrant in 10 years. With our SWAT team would be the only entity that would execute a no-knock warrant, and they use tactics and tools that eliminate the need for no-knock warrants. I know that was quick.
Thank you, Chief. I don't know if folks have questions for the Chief. Would like to hear from the other representatives. Yeah. I'd like to hear from the other representatives, but I didn't know the questions for Chief.
I do have a question. We don't have, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I just noticed you were in the.
Go ahead, I can wait, I'll wait.
I thought I had pressed it. I just had a question because, training came up as a concern and a question as it relates to how officers are actually responding to these aggressive situations. And so who is ultimately in charge of the police academy for Fulton County?
Well, ultimately, I'm responsible for the police academy.
Okay.
It is run by the Fulton County Police Department. We have staff there from the Sheriff's Department, the Marshal's Department, and MARTA. The Academy Director is one of our captains. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today because he's in training, but he has the responsibility for running the Fulton County Police Department, the Fulton County Training Academy.
Okay, and do we have specific training that addresses excessive use of force and anything related to what we're seeing that is arising from these protests and the issues that we're addressing with the officers? I was just informed that the DA is bringing, I think, 11 charges against the officer in this last shooting case. And so what kind of training are we giving our officers, our marshals, our sheriffs, as it relates to excessive use of force?
In terms of the training that our officers receive, it is based on, what the standard is. It's, you know, the standard is, 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 you know, the stand several hours long in terms of the training, so they get a background in terms of case law and use of force, as well as when force should be applied in a given situation.
Okay, and is it mandatory training?
It is mandatory
Every
training.
officer has to have?
Correct.
Okay.
In the basic law enforcement, which is the training for police officers, it is required there. And again, through the governor's initiative, it is then required every year for the officer to then have that in-service training every year in order to maintain their certification.
And do they have a specific length of time within which they are supposed to actually complete that training?
Within the calendar year.
Yeah, and then, so if anyone misses it for an emergency or a sickness or any reason, there's someone to ensure that they still go through that training?
Correct. They have the ability, if they have a good reason for not taking the training in the calendar year, to petition POST for an extension. But if they do not have a valid reason, then POST will pull their certification, or they can no longer be an officer.
All right, thank you so much.
Commissioner Carn? I could wait until the rest of the agency.
Colonel Graham, Fulton County Sheriff's Office. As Chief Halburn mentioned, they are the primary responsible party for the Fulton County Public Safety Training Center. However, I've brought Captain Brooks, who is actually the Assistant Director of the Training Center, as well as Lieutenant Stokes, who is actually responsible for teaching firearms training as well as use of force. So I will let them respond directly to the questions that was posed to the organizations. That'll give you a better feel as to what they actually teach the troops that come to the Public Safety Training Center. Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Captain Arlene Brooks. I'm with the training section. And my emphasis, I do have the range master of our agency here, but I would like to talk about the de-escalation and the other type of training that we like to give officers to help prepare them to de-escalate a situation. Currently, I'm putting great emphasis on mental health awareness, and I am now certified as a mental health first aid trainer. I just finished a class with new hires, and that class is actually for every new hire class. We also do standalone classes for mental health first aid. It does have enough scenario-based information on mental health awareness and how to talk to someone when they have anxiety issues, depression, suicidal, or even aggressive due to substance use. So that's kind of my wheelhouse to continue that particular emphasis on training for de-escalation and preparation for mental health. There may be reforms coming in the future where we have other support systems to help us in the field, and we want the officers to know what's happening if it's a social worker or an EMT or a doctor helping with someone in a mental health crisis. Do you have any questions about that training?
Thank you.
Good afternoon. As the Colonel said, my name is Kenya Stokes. I'm the Range Master for the Fulton County Sheriff's Office. One of my primary responsibilities is to let officers know when and when not to use deadly force. We also handle the defensive tactics part, which involves when you handcuff a suspect, after the resistance stop, the force that you used to get him to comply, him or her, should cease. The level should only rise when that occasion calls for it. And I have to point out, if we ask a person to comply and they don't comply, then that's when we have to use those steps. As the Colonel said, and as the Chief said, that doesn't mean I have to say go through these steps. It may go from here to here. A lot of it depends on whether or not the compliance is there. Once that level is reached, if they comply, that's supposed to stop. Once the handcuffs gets on that individual, they're supposed to be placed in a certain position to keep positional asphyxiation from happening. That means you can't lay on your chest because the lungs can't expand so that they'll have an opportunity to breathe. So we teach all of that in compliance with all of the rules for the Fulton County Public Safety Training Center. Anybody have any specific questions for me?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, Board. Maria McKee, Fulton County Marshal. I was also invited here to speak on policies regarding use of force for my department. However, I think that Chief Halbert and Lieutenant Stokes has pretty much covered all of that. All of our people train at the Fulton County Training Center, so we all partake in the same type training. So all of the examples that he gave would be ditto for my department. However, I would like to give you a little bit of background on my department, what our mission is and what we do. We are an arm of the court, the state and magistrate courts of Fulton County, having law enforcement authority with sworn law enforcement personnel. Our primary mission is to enforce the orders of the court. Thus, we provide court security, serve civil process, dispossessory warrants. We execute eviction writs as well as magistrate court warrants. We enforce writs of possession, conduct judicial sales, and in doing so, we also enforce federal, state, and local laws. The Marshal's Department has been an accredited agency since 1995, and we operate with a high degree of integrity and professionalism. I did go through all of the questions that Commissioner Ellis sent, and I can respond to those one by one. However, like I said earlier, the majority of those questions were answered previously by the chief and Lieutenant Stokes. Would you like to hear them? I can tell you this, we don't have a chokehold policy. As well, no-knock warrants don't apply to us. It's not addressed in our policy because it's not a part of our mission. So we don't do those. Let me see if it's something else that they didn't cover that I need to cover from my
Commissioner
department.
Hall has a question.
I thought Commissioner Carn was in.
He was,
We do have a formal use of force policy. It does have a reporting requirement, so all officers that use force against the subject are required to provide a written use of force report. Discipline is the same. It's according to Fulton County policies and procedures relating to discipline. So any offense that's found to be excessive use of force will go through that progressive discipline stage. Do you have any other questions?
Commissioner Carn?
Mhm.
all right, thank y'all so much. Great work, hard work, and tough work in today's time and day, I would imagine. Like I said, I wouldn't want your job. So hats off to you guys. Do we still train the multiple departments out at the Merck Road facility? I know we used to pretty much train everybody down here.
Yes.
And we're over that training, and we set the guidelines for that training. Is that about right? And I want to speak to this and put it on the public record so folks can kind of understand. People say, well, Fulton County, they don't do much policing because the county is, 99% municipalized. However, I think that's the furthest thing from the truth. Because technically speaking, we set the tone, give birth to, train, and raise up a vast majority of law enforcement officers throughout this county. So I think it goes more to the sense of your job being a whole lot more important than just training in your departments. You set the tone for hundreds of and thousands of police officers and generations of officers because they're trained up the way their supervisors were trained up, and so on and so forth. So I really can't stress enough how crucial right now it is to make those type of adjustments and really take a look at this thing, for the full face value that it is. Because at the end of the day, an officer's instinct is going to come back to that training they received and how they received it and what type of policing you are teaching officers, these young kids that are my daughter's age, 25 years old. They may police like that for the rest of their lives, and your training could literally be life or death for a resident, or for an officer. So I'll leave it at that, and I thank y'all.
Commissioner Hall?
Sorry about that. Looking for a plug. I think Commissioner Carn covered what I wanted to say.
Commissioner,
Thank you. Yes,
I
sir.
got just a couple more quick things. I mean, first off, thanks for coming down and waiting with us all day and being patient through our meetings and listening to all of that. But this is critically important, and I'm very grateful for you all coming down and sharing. Just to ask, I guess, for consideration. I know that a couple of you shared that policies are out there and they're available upon request. Just would ask if there be some consideration to just openly publishing those and putting those out there in the public domain. And not asking you to respond to that right now, but if that's the request, and if we could figure out a way which we could facilitate, putting that on our website and that sort of stuff in a way that people could more easily access. And then the second thing, I know, Chief, you addressed that this was something you were looking at, was potentially adopting a duty to intervene policy. And I don't know if the other agencies are looking at that and considering the same. It just, when you'll reach a decision on that, you could come back, if you could share that in some sort of fashion with us, not necessarily have to come back and present it, but just, kind of share with us the conclusions on that. I know that that's obviously getting a lot of discussion within, kind of the law enforcement community and, an interest from our citizens and so forth. So there's just those two asks. And again, thank you all for what you do and for coming down.
And Commissioner, if I may, I wanted to
share
expand on what Commissioner Carn was speaking to about the training, because it's not only for Fulton County agencies. We are a regional academy. I think we train over 40 different agencies in the metro area, as well as 5 different federal agencies utilize our training academy. So it's not just Fulton County, so I just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Madam Clerk?
Page 9, 20-0444, discussion, Fulton County Board of Health, sponsored by Chairman Pitts.
All right, just very quickly, in 2017, and I was not here, I think most of you were, that was when legislation was approved regarding the transition of our health employees to the state. So that legislation, I will have it on the agenda at our next meeting, and we'll forward you a copy as no later than the day after tomorrow, so you can become very, very familiar. It is state law now. It's something that we have to do. The only question is how we do it, but we have to do it. So, next item.
What is it, Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
I guess, are you going to provide some sort of contact for what?
Yes.
I didn't really understand.
Yes. Yes. Now? No. I just wanted to it's coming with an explanation as to why we need to do it.
Okay, thank you.
We have 2 items on the consent agenda removed for separate consideration by Commissioner Hall. First item on page 3, 20-0418, behavioral health and developmental disabilities. Request approval to amend an existing contract to provide supportive housing services.
Commissioner Hall.
Hello, Latrina. This is great stuff. So my only question was, are these the units that Fulton County is providing the wraparound services for? It was resolution 19-0417 last year that we approved, where we were partnering with Partners for Home and I think Atlanta Homeless Continuum of Care.
Yes, so it's a part. Good evening, Latrina Foster, Director of the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. This is a partnership between the Department of Behavioral Health and Partners for Home on the establishment of 550 permanent supportive housing units over the next 5 years.
All right, thank you so much. That was my only question.
Go ahead and entertain a motion to approve.
Second, we'll move approval.
Second. All right, let's vote, please.
And the vote is open. And the motion passes unanimously. Also on page 3, 20-0419, Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, request approval to amend an existing contract to provide clinical child and adolescent services for grant-funded Clubhouse program.
And for this one, I just wanted you to explain to our viewing and listening audience exactly what this is, because I've had questions from people about what do we do with the youth as far as mental and behavioral health, and this is a good one too.
Absolutely. So the Clubhouse for Youth is a state-funded program where we're allocated grant dollars every year by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities to provide early prevention and intervention for youth at risk of engaging in, for providing So the program is designed to work with individuals or youth at risk of being a part of the juvenile justice system, or at school, at risk of being kicked out of school because engaging in illegal drug activity or because of the peers that they associate with. So within this program, we provide prevention and education around substance use and misuse. We have our participants engage in very proactive extracurricular activities, as well as we pull in their family members to ensure that we're working cohesively with the family as well as the youth in the program. And then in addition to that, we also provide group and individual therapy within the system as well.
Thank you. Move approval.
Second. Let's vote, please.
And the vote is open. And the motion passes unanimously. On the page 2 of the add-on memo, items that were added to today's recess meeting agenda, sponsored by Vice Chair Arrington, 20-0446, request approval of a resolution urging Fulton County law enforcement partners to reinforce and enact additional policies limiting all personnel from employing a neck restraint or chokehold to restrain people being taken into or in police custody.
Motion.
Commissioner Harrington?
Second.
All right, properly moved and seconded. You want to add anything?
Anybody that is, living right now sees what's going on. It should be self-explanatory. I would hope that we would get unanimous approval of all of these 3 resolutions. I know Commissioner is joining in and sponsoring them. And Commissioner Hall, that's fine, and Commissioner Ellis. We all saw George Floyd lose his life. It shouldn't happen. We saw Rashard Brooks lose his life. It shouldn't happen. He was asleep at a drive-thru. At best, he should be in jail for DUI. At best, he should be in jail for DUI. He should not be dead. He should not use deadly force, particularly with people who have committed misdemeanors or maybe haven't even committed any crime. So, God bless you if you vote against these.
All right, Vice Chair, may I ask you a quick question? It reads, I'm assuming it would apply to the unincorporated area in the county.
And
But-
yes, and
but-
probably in an unincorporated
But
area.
urging all other departments within the county to do the same. Is that correct?
Yes, and all cities
Got it.
within the county to do the same.
Understand. Let's vote. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner House.
I just didn't know if the police chief might have any comments on any of these. If he doesn't, fine, but just give him the opportunity.
Commissioner, again, Darrell Halbert, Chief of Police. Relative to this particular item, our policy already prohibits the use of chokeholds, so I can support that. As the Commissioner indicated, there's no need for that in this day and age. There are other methods that we can train on or that we actually use and other devices that we actually use to control an individual. So.
The other 2 resolutions.
The other 2, the other one, The final one, I'm not that familiar with. I haven't read all three of the resolutions, so.
The second one is duty to report excessive force by another officer. The third one is shoot to kill, and we can get to that when we want to, but, you know, police officers are trained to shoot to kill. If you care anything about black people not being killed, then you will vote for that. There's no,
Okay, let's separate them, take them one at a time. But the one that's before us now, we have a motion to approve. Let's cast your vote, please.
And the vote is open. And the motion passes unanimously.
All right, next item.
20-0447, request approval of a resolution urging Fulton County law enforcement partners to reinforce and enact additional policies limiting all personnel from employing deadly force to only those circumstances where a threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or others is imminent and for other purposes.
Vice Chair?
this is the one, again, police officers are trained to shoot to kill. If you care anything about police officers not killing black people, then you will support this.
Move approval.
There's no reason to shoot to kill because somebody might be DUI. There's no reason to shoot to kill because somebody may have stole some candy from a store. And so what this does is allow it in certain limited circumstances.
All right, motion is to approve. Let's vote. I'm sorry.
Chairman?
Commissioner Morris.
Since the chief is up here, there's one resolved clause which reads that the Board of Commissioners urges that the use of deadly force be limited to only those situations where a suspect has committed or is in the process of committing a felony involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious physical injury or death, and the escape of the suspect would pose an imminent danger of death or serious physical injury to the officer or to another person unless the suspect is apprehended without delay, and the officer has given a verbal warning to the suspect if time, safety, and circumstances permit. Is that consistent with your current policy?
Could you read that first part again, Commissioner? I didn't hear that part about the...
Yeah, well, actually, if you want to read it. My first father-in-law was a career police officer and a great guy. And, you know, his daughter, whom I married, always wondered whether he was going to come home every night at the end of his day. So it's a tough job, and they need to do it with training and with compassion and all the things this country's been talking about over the last few weeks. But I want to make sure that this is consistent with.
It's consistent with our policy, and it also appears to be consistent with state law, 17420, in terms of when...
Those are the only circumstances.
For the use of deadly force.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay, thank you.
I'm glad it's consistent, but right now it's about reforming the policies, the systemic policies that have resulted in the systemic termination of the lives of black people. And so even if it were not consistent, it's time for reforming those policies.
All right, is there a motion?
Yes, we have a motion.
All right, let's vote. Let's vote, please.
And the vote is open. And the motion passes unanimously. 20-0448, request approval of a resolution urging Fulton County law enforcement partners to reinforce and enact additional policies requiring all personnel to report incidents of potential officer and employee misconduct and for other purposes.
Move approval.
Vice.
Second.
Explain that one right quick.
This is if someone sees an officer holding his knee on a person's neck.
Another officer?
Another officer.
Anybody? Or just
Another officer.
Another officer.
I believe it says officer or employee. But basically the intent is to report misconduct or use of excessive force.
Commissioner Hall?
I just want to go back to the previous item because we forgot to add the sponsorships. I know Commissioner Carn and I asked to co-sponsor all three.
Yes, and I think Commissioner Ellis did as well. Have no
On all three. So this one as well. And that's all. I just want to make sure we're on there. Thank you.
So noted.
Cast your vote, please.
Mr. Chairman, before the vote is taken, there is a typo that we need to just correct. We need to insert the word urges, and we have that in the final version. It's urges. We can't
So
direct
noted.
the sheriff.
So noted.
Thank
Let's vote.
And the vote is open. And the motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, colleague.
One quick question for the chief before he left. In terms of your training facility, you have a specific budget for training, correct?
It's included within the departmental budget, correct?
Okay. I guess my question is, and I know we're gonna have soundings or whatever, I would hope that you maybe look at the next sounding, when it comes up to increase that, for reasons which I think are obvious. And I would imagine whatever you got in that particular, budget line item probably isn't enough, especially considering, some of these additional things that I think may be coming down from the federal and from the state level possibly. So I want to make sure you have that on your radar and up that funding. I know I certainly would support it. So
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. All right, there are no other items to come before us for action today. Without objection, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Sure.
Second.
Thank you very much. See you again here on next time.